Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us in our monthly webinar series. This webinar focuses on the convergent influence of masculine and racial identities on student success for men of color in community colleges. I am Frank Harris III, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. J. Luke Wood, with whom I co-direct M2C3. And we also want to acknowledge our Associate Director, Dr. Marissa Vasquez-Urias, who leads the research component of M2C3. Before we get into the actual content of the webinar, we do have a few important announcements and updates to offer. First is to let you know about our upcoming webinars. There are 3 coming up. The next one will take place in March that will focus on male student athletes of color in community colleges. Our April webinar series will focus on the impact of racial and gender microaggressions and how they influence student success for men of color in community colleges. And they will end the academic year with our designing and implementing early alert systems to support student success for men of color webinar. So we hope all of you are able to join us and be a part of these next webinars that explore what we believe are some very critical topics with regard to student success for men of color in community colleges. As always, we invite you all to engage with us during Twitter. If you would be so inclined to please use the hashtag M2C3 and tagging your Twitter post. We also really appreciate when participants of the webinars post pictures of themselves, pictures of their colleagues. So if you're willing to do that, we would greatly appreciate, and we'd love to see your photos as well. Of course, there are several important acknowledgments. First, we have to thank and acknowledge our wonderful affiliate partners of M2C3 with whom we have the distinct pleasure of co-hosting this consortium with, Achieving the Dream being one, the Association of Community College Trustees, the African American Male Education Network and Development, the Community College League of California, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, the League of Innovation in the Community College, and HTPA College Student Educators International. Thank you so very much for your consistent and unyielding support of us and the work that we do at M2C3. If you haven't already marked your calendars, we hope you'll take a moment to note our second annual consortium working group meeting that will take place here in San Diego on our campus, again, as it did last year, June 9th and 10th. Check our website for information about registration, accommodations. Also want to note that this year we're going to have a track for students as well. So there'll be an opportunity to invite students from your campuses to participate. We'll have some special programming that's going to be designed specifically for them. And so we hope that you'll take this opportunity to not only attend yourselves, but to invite some students who you think could really benefit from this experience and opportunity. We have a wonderful advisory board that's comprised of educational leaders throughout the country who care deeply about student success, about equity, and about community colleges. So we want to thank and acknowledge them for their support as well. If you have not already done so, please consider taking a look at the online professional development training course that we've put together that focuses on teaching men of color in community colleges. It has a faculty focus, classroom faculty focus, but there are a lot of implications and ideas and insights that will be value added for all folks who work at a community college, whether you work with students in the classroom or not. Would like to note that this course is offered external to SDSU through our Center for Organizational Responsibility and Advancement. The website is available here on your slide. It's www.corelearning.org. Take a look at it. There are some opportunities for institutional partnerships as well as group subscriptions and individual subscriptions as well. So we hope you'll take a look at it. Would like to note that the feedback that we've gotten from this course has been very positive. Colleagues across the country tell us that it's had a very immediate impact on the ways in which they engage and work with men of color, work with all students, but in particular men of color in the classroom. So take a look at it if you think it'll be value added for yourself, for your campus, or for your colleagues. One of the questions that we have gotten over the years is, how does our work, how is it transferable to high schoolers, to middle schoolers, and perhaps even students at the primary level? So we're pleased to announce that we have recently developed and launched, released a guidebook that focuses on K-12 educators and how to build their capacities to serve and support men of color. We're also going to have an online course that's going to accompany, where we'll take a lot of the content from the guidebook and actually package it in an online course. We'll have some live chat sessions that we have available for those who enroll in the course. So it's a real opportunity to sort of translate the ideas and concepts that we know are important for student success in community college, men of color in community colleges, but to sort of get those ideas in the field and in practice much early on, to hope that we have an opportunity to address, be more proactive in addressing some of the barriers and challenges that we know are significant and have an impact on the success of men of color throughout their educational pathways. So the purpose of this webinar is threefold. One of the key things that we'll do is we'll look to understand and have an intentional discussion about the ways in which salient identities shape the experiences of men of color in community colleges, obviously with the focus on the intersection of race and gender. I'll say that over the years, some things that we've observed through our work here at M2C3 is that campuses and educators are, I would say, very good at recognizing the impact of race and racism and racial prejudice and racial identity on the experiences of men of color. But we've been less intentional about exploring the impact of of gender and masculinity. So our goal today really is to bring this masculinity focus more to the forefront, because we know it has a real impact on experiences and success. That being said, the second purpose is to sort of recognize and unpack traditional patterns of male gender role socialization, and how do we see those patterns manifest and impact and serve as barriers to student success for men of color in community colleges. And then the third point is we will share findings and implications from a recent study that looks at the influence of masculinity on the experiences of Latino male community college students. One of the researchers here at M2C3 is leading that study, and Helica Palacio, she's done some outstanding work. So we'll share some of the initial insights from that study as they relate to masculinity for Latino males. So that being said, we would like to spend the next few minutes spending some time in unpacking and understanding why identities matter. Why should we be concerned about the intersection of these salient identities being race and gender, and to what extent do they have an impact or have some influence on the salient trends and issues that we see impacting men of color in community colleges? So the first point is that we understand and recognize that insufficient attention has been given to identity in the community college student success literature that focuses on men of color in community colleges. So we know, for example, colleague Dr. Sean Harper and I wrote almost a decade ago, interesting enough, that most of what we know in terms of the published research about men of color in community colleges pertains to how many enroll, how many actualized their aspirations when they entered, and then secondarily to what extent in which they're engaged in educationally purposeful activities. Not much has been written, or at least at that point, and we would still say that the same continues to be true about identities and why they matter, and to what extent we as educators need to be mindful of them. So that's one point there. Second, we also recognize, and the research that we've done, and not just us, but a lot of the scholars across the country who do work on boys and men of color, recognize that there are some things that take place that many of the prior educational experiences that men of color bring to community colleges are largely influenced by their racial and gender identities. So things that take place within the K through 12 context, which we'll talk a lot about later in this webinar, the inequitable disciplinary practices, recognizing that boys of color are suspended at disproportionately, and I would also add unacceptably high rates in comparison to their white male peers. Racial prejudice and gender stereotypes that compel educators to assume that boys and men of color are not capable of learning at the same rate as other students. And then racial microaggressions that lead educators to engage and work with boys and men of color in ways that suggest that, again, that they're not capable, that they don't belong in any type of academic or educational experience. All of these trends and issues are informed, and I would say fueled by perceptions of gender and racial identity with regard to boys and men of color. Then we also have to recognize that there are some things that occur, some salient experiences that occur outside of community colleges and outside of education, but that still have a significant impact on identities and the ways in which men of color see themselves as belonging in post-secondary education and in community colleges. Criminalization, police brutality, mass incarceration. These are societal factors and issues that are deeply rooted, that are informed and fueled by systemic oppression that have been going on for a long time, but that suggests to boys and suggests to men, in the context of our webinar here, suggests to men of color that they're not college material, that they don't belong, and that they're not worthy of the same opportunities as others. And then we also know this, that the recently published research on men of color in community colleges links identities, particularly gender and masculine identities, to some key non-cognitive outcomes that are critical to student success, notably student self-efficacy, simply stated, the extent to which they have confidence in their ability to be successful, degree utility, the ways in which men make assessments and evaluations about the worthiness of the degrees or the credentials that they're pursuing in a community college, locus of control, to whom do they attribute success and failure, or success or a lack of success, better stated, action control, to the extent to which young men are able to focus on academic matters and academic pursuits in light of challenges and other things that may be going on externally, environmental challenges in particular, and intrinsic interest. To what extent do young men, or do men of color in community colleges, how connected are they? How authentically interested are they in the content in which they're learning? All of these factors, which we know have a direct link to student success, are informed by identity issues, the ways in which men of color see themselves as racial and gender beings. Now, that being said, I think it's important that we spend some time discussing what we call agents of male gender role socialization. We recognize and understand that when we look at any type of identity construct, be it race or gender, those constructs are considered to be socially constructed. They have a set of meanings and expectations that are ascribed to them. So we want to talk about what does that mean for men, and in particular for males of color. So the first point we have to make is this: messages about manhood and masculinity, or in other words, the ways in which we know and understand men to be men, are socially constructed by several sources. So to state this more simply, males are socialized and taught the meanings, values, and behaviors that are associated with masculinity. So we know that schools have an impact. We know that male peers have an impact. We know that families are really important in terms of teaching young boys what it means to be a man and how they should engage and express and perform their identities as men. Fathers for young men who have fathers in the home play a critical role, and media does as well. With regard to family influences, men of color are socialized by family members who teach them social expectations and norms around gender. And at an early age, we see this very clearly in the type of clothing, decorations, and toys that are very gender specific and that serve to shape perceptions of who young men are and who they should be from very early ages. We also know that children observe and catch on to verbal and nonverbal cues and behaviors that are largely performed by adults according to socially prescribed norms and expectations. And again, referencing the piece that Dr. Sean Harper and I wrote almost a decade ago, we noted that children learn throughout their development that domestic duties are culturally associated with women and femininity, and conversely, men and masculinity is associated with duties that represent physical rigor, strength, and power. Fathers play a key role in this as well. Fathers influence social construction of gender and masculinity for boys, again, primarily through toys, games, punishment, sports. They often play a key role in instilling values of toughness, competition, and aggressiveness. And I would say above all, boys learn at a fairly young age that there's little to no acceptance of values and behaviors that are socially socially coded as gay, feminine, or unmanly. And then fathers also reinforce this idea that comes from the work of James O'Neill about being restricted emotionality. The only emotions that you are allowed to express as a male are those that convey anger, right? So fear and being vulnerable, crying to a certain degree are largely unacceptable. And when young men display those behaviors, they're often met with swift punishment. So in this respect, both families and fathers play a critical role at the very early ages in socializing boys to become men, and not only be men, but be men in ways that will allow them to meet societal norms around what it means to be a man. We also have to think about male peers and school influence. And we would say here that peers often reinforce and extend messages about manhood that emerge and that are salient within family influences. And we know that the influence of these messages is apparent as boys often use words such as girl and sissy to express insults to one another. Boys learn at a fairly young age that if you really want to insult another man or another male, the best way that you can do that is by attacking his sexual orientation or his masculinity. That's something that's fairly common. And then we also know that boys who do not express themselves as men according to expected norms are told to man up or to boy up. And the connotation here is that they have to be more aggressive. They need to be they need to be less emotional, and they have to be tougher and more powerful. And these messages are incredibly powerful, as many boys will conform to gender norms in order to avoid criticism of their gender performance. That occurs through sports. That occurs to a lot of the interactions that young males have in exchange with each other at pretty early ages. So males do things to avoid insults. Physicality is something that they embrace, even if they're not comfortable doing so. We also know that the young man who studies hard, the young man who's openly studious, who follows the rules, who's engaged in class, that's the same young man that has difficulty establishing respectful relationships with peers or having some status among male peers, because the assumption is that achievement in school and masculinity are really not aligned, or that they're incompatible. And then we also have to be mindful of the impact of media. Media that celebrates images of masculinity that also prioritizes aggression, competition, power, and control amongst men. And if we were to think about your typical images of men of color in media, there's a pretty narrow list of constructions that we often see here. It's typically the thug, the pimp, the social deviant, the athlete, the entertainer, often as a person who's unintelligent, who's lazy, or who's angry. So now, having really spent some time discussing these agents of male gender role socialization, would like to transition to some of the patterns of masculinity that we see in the community colleges that we've often visit. right? So we've talked about the influences, the salient influences that construct masculinity in a very hegemonic and narrow way. Well, how does that manifest, and how do we see that play out at the community colleges where we have the opportunity to work and spend time with both students and faculty and staff there? And before delving into that particular part of the discussion, I do think it's important to acknowledge that one real critical issue and concern about traditional patterns of male gender role socialization is that they construct masculinity in a very narrow way. So in many ways, it sort of suggests to men, to boys and men, that in order to be a quote-unquote real man, or in order to be respected or considered a man, that you have these a very narrowly defined set of roles and expectations that you can perform, and anything that falls outside of that is suspect or questioned, or not authentic or not worthy of respect as a man, right? So I think part of what we have to do, even though our focus today is about understanding the negative impact of a narrowly defined, socially constructed idea of masculinity has on student success for men of color, we have to recognize that the impact is much broader than education, right? And that there's a lot of work to be done with regard to challenging this larger hegemonic system of what it means to be a man, and how it in many ways sort of paints this picture of masculinity that says that you have to fit into these boxes in order to be perceived or considered a real man, which is limiting and debilitating in a lot of ways. So that said, we'd like to transition to and discuss 4 patterns or 4 ways in which we see the influences of these agents of masculinity play out on the campuses where we've gotten the opportunity to visit. And I would say is this, that there are 4 key behavioral patterns that we often see, and we'll spend some time talking about each of these. But the first is poor help seeking. Second is the tendency for men of color to perceive school as a feminine domain. Third is this embracing of this breadwinner orientation or this breadwinner role. And fourth is hyper competitiveness. So let's start with help seeking or poor help seeking. And poor help seeking is essentially what we describe as an unwillingness to seek help for personal or academic problems, unwillingness to utilize campus support services, and primarily due to fear of being perceived as a dependent, weak, or feeling as though one's masculinity will be compromised. And so we have a quote here from a piece that Dr. Wood and Helike and I published not long ago, where a participant said, "I feel one thing that I've learned from my father, and it's not like bad. I love everything that my father taught me. He taught me a lot about pride, and it's something that I have a lot of sense of pride. With that, I feel that because of the culture that I have, it's a lot of that machismo, which is the masculinity of not asking for help or being a man or showing people you're strong." And I think this is a significant point, because we know from our work that being willing to seek help and being willing to utilize support services and being willing to accept help when it's offered is a real critical factor that has an impact on the likelihood that men of color are successful in community college, particularly men of color who may have been out of school for quite a while, or who may have some needs that need to be remediated, or whatever it may be. But being willing to seek help is really important. So we recognize that poor help seeking is a behavior that should concern us when we see it, and one in which we have to be very intentional with regard to interventions. Some of the practices that we advocate in our work with addressing this issue is to make help, it's part of being intrusive and making help available without students having to ask for it. So an example that we often use is, if you're teaching a math course, and you know that math tutoring is something that's really important and can have a real positive impact on students being successful in the course. Well, let's not let that be an optional activity. Let's build that into the course. Let's have it be a part of the grade in the course, hold students accountable, and so forth. So then using the math tutoring center or going to the math lab is not seen as I need additional help, but it's seen as something that's a part of everyone's learning and growth and development within the course. All right. Our second behavioral pattern is perceptions of school as a feminine domain. And here, the way that we describe this is regarding men's tendencies to view school and academic learning as feminine endeavors that are more suited for women. This can be particularly acute among men who have a strong breadwinner orientation, which we'll discuss in the next slide, and assume that earning money should be a top priority for men, especially those who have families. And this pattern, we often say that this pattern stems from the fact that most K through 12 school educators happen to be white women, which reinforces assumptions about educational context, such as the classroom, being feminine spaces. So we recognize this is a challenge and it's a pattern that we see, and we talk with faculty that we have the opportunity to engage with about doing things that help students see school, see community college, see their engagement in school as gender neutral endeavors, that we have to kind of remove the stigma, the gendered stigma that's associated with school and academic spaces and so forth. Our next behavioral pattern is breadwinner orientation. And this pattern occurs when students make academic and career decisions based on internalized pressures to earn money and take care of family and oneself, and really to fulfill this masculine expectation that as a man in a family, your job is to essentially bring home money, right, by any means necessary. And it can also be influenced by this concept called capital identity projection that Dr. Wood developed several years ago. And this concept captures men's tendencies to measure their self-worth, to measure themselves and assess themselves as men based on the accumulation and display of material wealth. So we see here from the quote where a young man from Gardenhire Crooks et al. Study noted, "It's like as a man, I still got to support she," referring to his partner. "She's not working at the moment. She's got to go to school. So I still have to come up with the money to help my father pay rent, pay my car insurance, pay my gas, fix my car, and still send money to her so I can at least help her out with her cell phone bills, clothes, and stuff like that. Even though she lives with her parents, but still me as a man, like I can't say, yeah, live off your father. That's not me." And we know that young men, many of whom are enrolled in community college, really have to negotiate this pressure of, and is it okay that I make the sacrifices that I need to making sacrifices with regard to money in order to go to school, to pursue an education that will likely pay off in the long run, but right now is not allowing me to fulfill this role that I've been socialized to fulfill, and that being one of breadwinner. So that's our third behavioral pattern. And finally, competitiveness is our fourth behavioral pattern. And this stems from an unhealthy desire to compete with others and feeling as though one's self-worth as a man is measured by one's ability to outdo or outperform others. So referencing the study by Palacios et al. That I noted a couple of slides ago, I had a participant here say, when men do not succeed in school in relation to other men, they may feel a sense of being lesser than their masculine peers. As a result, men can withdraw their interest in school and place it in other domains of competition where they experience greater levels of success. So the key point here is that for young men, or for men who actually subscribe to this hyper-competitive identity, when they're not able to compete at a level that they feel is appropriate in an academic context, then they're more likely to withdraw and go pursue other avenues or other areas in which they feel like they can be competitive or hyper-competitive in this case. So also extending this idea of hyper-competitiveness, some concepts, some things that we see that might suggest, or I should say, things that we hear that might suggest a hyper-competitive mindset. First, as a man, I find it necessary to compete with my classmates. Sure, I have my own standards, but I'm really driven to outdo others. I'm choosing this major because I want to make a lot more money than my friends is another one. And finally, I don't really like group work because it means I have to share my answers. And if I do that, then I won't get the highest grade in the class. So these are some things to be mindful of, particularly for our faculty colleagues, as they're working with students to engage in collaborative learning. These are some things to be mindful of, that because you might observe and hear them among some of your male students of color. So now we'd like to spend the remainder of our time on the webinar sharing some reflections from community college men of color. And again, this is a study, the reflections here are going to be derived from a study of a group of Latino males who are enrolled at a community college in Southern California, and Helica Palacios, who I've noted several times in this webinar as the lead researcher on this study. The study involved individual interviews with 25 students who identified as Mexican-American male students. They were all students who attended a community college. And as you can see from some of the demographics here of the sample, that there was great diversity in the sample with regard to the number of units enrolled, ranging from 3 to 9 units to upwards of 18 units during the term in which the data were collected, as well as good diversity with regard to units earned. We can also see here that 80% of the men were employed, indicated they were employed at some sort of work. And I would say, looking at the hours work, on average, looks like the guys were on average employed at about anywhere from 10 to 20 hours per week, although there were some who were reported being employed in upwards of 30 to 40 hours per week. The age range, majority of the participants were in the what would be considered traditional age, college age, so 18 to 19, 20 years old. 80% were born in the United States. And very interesting to note that 92% of the students identified themselves as first-generation college students. From this study, there were 3 salient themes that we'd like to share that are informative for our discussion today. The first theme is that the participants felt as though completing their college education was an important milestone to becoming what they considered to be real men. Participants felt like they weren't real men or hadn't fully developed as men until they earned a college degree. As one participant noted, quote, "Well, I guess because I have a job that helps me, I know I can't fully be a man. I'm like a young adult at this moment in time. So I feel as though once I get out of college, once I have a stable job, and once maybe I even have a family, I feel that's when I can declare myself a man." Along the same lines, another student shared, "Manhood, I don't think it's happened so far because my definition of manhood is like living on your own kind of thing. So I don't think it's happened yet." So interesting, with these participants, they really felt as though having a college degree, being on their own, taking care of themselves, that was what really completed the circle with regard to being men and manhood. And finally, a third participant said, quote, "For me, it's really important for my personal goal, it being completing a college degree. It's just kind of like completing my life. I graduated through high school, I served my country, now being educated, it's like that final all-around piece that I need." So again here, recognizing that for these participants, their concept or their definition of masculinity or what it meant to be a man, that it wasn't driven necessarily or exclusively by the societal expectations around toughness, around aggressiveness, and even around breadwinning, but really around being educated and completing a college degree is what ultimately made them real men. From this study, there were 3 salient themes that we'd like to share that are informative for our discussion today. The first theme is that the participants felt as though completing their college education was an important milestone to becoming what they considered to be real men. Participants felt like they weren't real men or hadn't fully developed as men until they earned a college degree. As one participant noted, quote, "Well, I guess because I have a job that helps me, I know I can't fully be a man. I'm like a young adult at this moment in time. So I feel as though once I get out of college, once I have a stable job, and once maybe I even have a family, I feel that's when I can declare myself a man." Along the same lines, another student shared, "Manhood, I don't think it's happened so far because my definition of manhood is like living on your own kind of thing. So I don't think it's happened yet." So interesting with these participants, they really felt as though having a college degree, being on their own, taking care of themselves, that was what really completed the circle with regard to being men and manhood. And finally, a third participant said, quote, "For me, it's really important for my personal goal, it being completing a college degree. It's just kind of like completing my life. I graduated through high school, I served my country, now being educated, it's like that final all-around piece that I need." So again here, recognizing that for these participants, their concept or their definition of masculinity or what it meant to be a man, that it wasn't driven necessarily or exclusively by the societal expectations around toughness, around aggressiveness, and even around breadwinning, but really around being educated and completing a college degree is what ultimately made them real men. Our second theme deals with the concept of help seeking. And in this study, the participants noted that help seeking was a real challenge and concern for them in high school. Again, recognizing the assumptions that they felt that others would make about their capacity to learn if they sought help, as well as what it meant with regard to their masculine and gender identities. But the participants in this study recognized that as time passed in college, they quickly learned that help seeking was essential to their success, and they grew more comfortable asking for help. So one participant noted, "I think towards the beginning, when they being other Mexican American men first struggle, it's hard to ask for help because men try to be prideful. And I think that's a thing in Mexican culture as well, where they're prideful people. We don't like to ask for help at the beginning. But I think once we notice that we can't do this alone or we need the help, we look towards the people who we know we can count on for help." Another shared, "Yeah, community college has changed a lot. It's been better than it was in high school. In high school, I was not scared, but nervous of asking for help. Like people would look at me and were like, 'You should know this,' or just being nervous when people like, 'Hey, can you help me out?' But in reality, they would help you out. You just got to come at them in a good way." And finally, a third participant with regard to help seeking had this to say, "I think it takes a lot more to ask for help than to shy away from it. Sometimes I find it hard to ask for help because I feel like it's my pride, and I think sometimes that's where masculinity comes in. You're trying to be like, oh, I can do this, I can take care of myself." Again, with the whole being able to provide or take care of. But sometimes I feel I have to break down that barrier and ask, and I think that's hard sometimes. But if you don't get something, you need to break down that. So all three participants really talked about this process that they had to sort of undertake to go from not being willing to ask for help or not seeing it as important to recognizing the critical role that it plays in their success as men of color in community college. And our final thing relates to the concept of breadwinning. And here, participants talked about breadwinning and recognized that part of what led them to pursue their college education was the idea that they had responsibilities as men. But their concept of breadwinning seemed to be much broader than what's traditionally reported in the literature. So for these guys, it wasn't about capital identity projection, but it was about altruism and being selfless and being concerned about the welfare for others, particularly family members. So as one student noted, it's not just about being a man, too. It's about thinking like a man, and being a man is being responsible and being mature about your surroundings and making sure that you're working and your bills are paid and that you're there for your family. Another student had something similar to say. "I was so fixated on the fact that a man had to be like so masculine, and you have to be strong, and you have to kind of be like the whole American culture you see on TV. But now I think of it as just being able to support yourself and take care of your family and making sure that everyone else just takes care of them and having a steady lifestyle, nothing too crazy." So with that said, there are several implications for teaching and serving community college men of color that emerge both from the study as well as some of the concepts that we discussed earlier in the webinar. So for starters, critical reflection is a practice that we strongly advocate in work with men of color in community colleges. So we see this Giving men the opportunity to reflect and think critically about the social construction of gender and masculinity in courses that they're taking, perhaps in student services that they utilize, and in student programs that target, particularly those that target men of color, so like minority male initiatives, for example, that we often see on many community college campuses. So some questions that might guide what we do in providing those opportunities for critical reflection are, what does it mean to be a man, right? So starting with this definition of what is a man, what does it mean to be a man, and where does this concept come from? Who gets to decide and define what masculinity is? A second question is, to whom do I give power and authority to shape how I see myself as a man? So really having men think about looking at gender, looking at masculinity from a self-authorship perspective, and recognize that they have a lot more control and agency over how they see themselves as men and how they feel about themselves as men. And they just have to exercise that. And thirdly, in what ways might the ways in which I see myself as a man serve as a barrier to my academic success? So the goal here is to get men to recognize how traditional social constructions of gender and masculinity in educational settings may actually serve or hinder their success, hinder the goals, or serve as a barrier to the goals in which they enrolled in the community college to pursue. Next is to help faculty recognize the influence of masculinity on help seeking. We've talked a lot about this notion that, we think about what it means to be a man and the ways in which masculine and socially constructed help seeking is not something or not a behavior that's embraced or assumed to be embraced within this masculine concept. Classroom engagement as well as collaborative learning, and with regard to collaborative learning, thinking about the role of hyper-competitiveness and how that might impact the ways in which students work with each other in the classroom, and the ways in which they see these as valuable learning opportunities. Third is employing intrusive practices during the early stages of matriculation, recognizing that when men enter the community college, they're probably going to need more support around a lot of the issues that we discussed earlier, with regard to help seeking and seeing self-concept, defining one's self-concept as a man and so forth. But that we can be less intrusive as they matriculate, as they become more knowledgeable about the college environment, as an example, and as they gain more confidence in how they see themselves and how who they are as men or who they want to be as men is connected to their goals, and the goals that led them to enroll in community college to begin with. And then lastly, with regard to implications, we often talk about positive messaging and validation is really critical to student success for men of color, recognizing that it's something that most guys report that they did not receive during the earlier stages of their schooling experience. So being able to tell them that they can be successful, they belong here, you expect them to do well, that's important to counter those misconceptions and those negative stereotypes about men of color and their capacities to learn, as well as the misconceptions about school being a feminine domain. And finally, we see an opportunity to leverage men of color's commitment to family and communities, particularly when we think about that third thing we presented around breadwinning, making a connection to that in this concept of familioso that our colleague Victor Sines at the University of Texas introduced not too long ago in a recently published article. But seeing familioso as a way to encourage men of color to persist, to overcome barriers that get into their, that impede their opportunities for success, helping them make connections between so for example, a question we might get them to explore is beyond money. What do you want to get out of your college education? Recognizing that many men of color are likely to say, I want to be a role model in my community. I want to be able to improve my community. I want to contribute to the success of others. These are all potentially good leverage points that can fuel and propel men of color towards success. Another question might be, how might earning a college degree change the entire educational trajectory of boys and young men of color in your family? So helping them see that their pursuit of a college education is bigger and broader than themselves, Because if we can do that, then we run into those moments where things are difficult and things don't seem like they're going to work out. There's a greater likelihood that they'll stick through and stick with it. So with that, our last implication, we'd like to thank you all once again for your incredible support, for joining us during this webinar. We hope that everyone will join us again next month and in the following months when we present our webinars on male student athletes of color, on racial microaggressions, and on early alert systems in March, April, and May respectively. So hope you'll be able to join us for that. And thank you again for your care and commitment and concern for student success for men of color. Have a good rest of the week.